Good evening. Four criteria of electronic music. The first criterion is the unified time structuring. The second criterion is the splitting of the sound. The third, the multi-layered spatial composition. The fourth, the equality of sound and noise, or better, of tone and noise. I would like to thank you very much for coming to listen to what I want to say about these four criteria. One might ask, why are they interesting? As there is electronic music, and everybody can make up his mind what to think about this music. New means change the method. New methods change the experience, and new experiences change man. In particular, in the field of music, because the sound waves penetrate very deep into the molecular and atomic layers of ourselves. Whenever we hear sounds, we are changed, we are no longer the same after having heard certain sounds. And this is the more the case when we hear organized sounds, organized by another human being, music. At about 1950, it was no longer self-understood that a sound is a sound. Because the idea to compose the sounds themselves came up as a result, we might say, of the historical development, the school of Vienna, of the Viennese composers, had reduced the musical objects, the themes, the motives, to entities of only two sounds, intervals. Webern in particular, Anton von Webern. And when I started to compose music, I certainly was a child of the spirit of the first half of the century, continuing and widening what the composers of the first half had prepared. And it took a little step to have the idea to compose a single sound, to synthesize a sound. I should immediately say that it was a second thought, because I started analyzing all sorts of sounds. I recorded sounds in the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, where you can find all the exotic instruments. Instruments of wood, of stones, the lithophones, of metal, of all different cultures, and of all the different historical periods. But I also analyzed sounds which I recorded in the daily life. All sorts of noises. I began to study books in which you can find the analysis of vowels, of the classical musical instruments, and one by one, not having had any good training at the music conservatory or at the university in acoustics, one by one, I became aware that a sound is not just a sound. And I became very interested in the differences between the sounds. What is the difference between a piano sound and a vowel A and the sound of the wind? Oh, and after having analyzed a lot of sounds, this second thought came up. It was always implied, if I can analyze sounds which exist already, which I can record, why can I not try to synthesize sound in order to find new sounds, if possible? And at that time, we had only instruments which tried to imitate classical instruments. You find them in bars, not yet in the symphony orchestras, because the symphony orchestra up to now is a fairly closed sound world because of its social composition. So, for example, no electric organs of the modern type of organs can be found in symphony orchestras easily. But, for example, in pop groups nowadays, you will find a lot of equipment that has been produced by companies who have started building instruments with keyboards and certain registers like organ stops to imitate trumpets, flutes, clarinets, etc. They add now more and more gimmicks to transform these sounds. Nevertheless, there was this catalog, if I might say, of a certain variety of timbres, as we say, like a painter who has got a certain collection of colors which he can buy, and then he starts mixing them. The classical instrumentation up to the present day, with the instruments which we can name, has been an art of mixing. The idea to synthesize a sound must have something that is more basic, more simple than the sounds you can find in the daily life. And I started investigating in acoustic laboratories what might be available as the most simple sound wave, for example, sine wave generators, which were used for measurement. And I started very primitively to synthesize individual sounds by superimposing sine waves in harmonic spectrums in order to make etc., all the vowels. And then I found one by one generators which produce what we call the white noise, comparable to the white color, and which you can filter with electric filter in order to produce colored noise, like etc. And when I make just then it comes very close to certain water noises. There you are. It started very primitively to synthesize the sound. What is important is that I tried more and more, like many others did then in French studios. That's where I began to study these things. It was 23 years. In the group so-called Musique Concrète, they recorded sounds and transformed them with electric devices. for example, speed up sounds. Everybody who has got a record player knows how to speed up or speed down music just by changing the speed. Well, this is very important, that we can, since the late 40th of this century, change the speed of a tape recorder continuously, not just discontinuously, and transform sounds by speeding up sounds. Let's immediately jump to the extreme. Then we come to the first criterion. If you take a Beethoven symphony and speed it up, and if you are able to speed it up in such a way that you do not at the same time transpose the pitch, the register of this Beethoven symphony. Let's say we would have an electric device that it sounds still with the same registers, in the same registers, but we would compress it in time. And we would compress it to such an extent that it would last just 1 second. Then we get a sound which has a particular color, as we say, particular timbre, a particular shape, dynamic shape, and its inner life, which is so highly compressed in time, is what Beethoven has composed. And it is a characteristic sound compared to, let's say, the compression of a piece of kakaku music from Japan. On the other hand, if we take any given sound and spread it out, expand it in time to such an extent that it would last 20 minutes, a sound which lasted, when we recorded it, for 1 second or 2 seconds, then we will have a musical piece. And its form, its large form in time, will be the expansion of the microacoustic structure, time structure, that was in the sound. There we are. I started to compose sounds in a new way about 1955-56. What I did is I recorded, for example, electric pulses, individual pulses. Then I spliced them together in particular rhythm. Then I made a tape loop with this rhythm. Let's say you have tak, tak, tak. And then that is the rhythm, just as simple as possible, and make a loop and speed it up. Tarak tak, 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 etc. Then it becomes continuous, and then when I speed it up, then after a while you hear a very low sound rising, which means when this little period is no longer tarak tak, tarak tak, tarak tak, tarak tak, which is almost a second, tarak tak, tarak tak, but it would last, let's say, 1/16 of a second, then this period determines the periodic, what we call the fundamental period of a sound, which is a very low organ sound, 16 vibrations per second, we say. And its color, its timbre, is the result of taraktat, compared to tarakatarat, takatatarat, takatatarat, that would give a different color. Naturally, you don't hear the rhythm anymore, but you hear a specific, what we call a color, which is a specific kind of a composition of its components, spectrum. Well, now imagine that you speed up a sound, a rhythm which lasted 1 second, 1,000 times, then the individual period lasts 1,000th of a second, which means you have a sound in the middle range of audibility, with a constant pitch. Well, it's about 2 octaves above the middle of the piano. 1,000 cycles per second. And it has a particular timbre. So I made a lot of experiments with different rhythms in order to see what do these different rhythms give as differences in timbre. And there we are. What, under a certain perspective, is perceived as a rhythm, in a faster time of perception, is perceived as pitch, with its melodic qualities. You can build melodies by changing the basic period, making it faster or slower. That means the sound goes up or down. And when I have such a basic periodicity, and I have these inner subdivisions given by a rhythm, then I, as I said, have the so-called partials, the subdivision of periodicity. And I perceive it as the so-called timbre, the differences in color. Now, if this sound is not periodic, but changes the periodicity a little faster, a little slower, or to be more precise, a little longer, a little shorter, the individual period, then the sound starts oscillating around a certain middle frequency. And all the half vowels or half consonants, for example, they are already fairly broad in oscillating around a middle frequency. So the continuum between a sound with a fixed pitch and a noise is nothing but more or less stable periodicity. And the noisiest noise is the most aperiodic periodicity, if you like. It's no longer periodic. And that's what we perceive as noises. This was extremely important, that the continuum between sound and noise, about which I will speak as the fourth criterion of today's talk, the continuum becomes available. You can control it. You can compose it, organize it. Now we speed down any given rhythm, and we come into the realm of form, what we consider being form. What is form in music? Well, usually we say a musical piece lasts between, let's say in the entertainment music, between 2 minutes or 3 minutes, and a Mahler symphony, which might last an hour and a half, but that is approximately the longest we have encountered in our tradition. There are a few operas which last longer, in particular operas of the end of the 19th century, which brought in very important expansions of the musical time. But there's nothing like, let's say, the Omitsutori in Japan, in the Todaichi temple in Nara, which lasts 3 days and 3 nights without any break. Or a certain musical ritual in a certain tribal situation in, let's say, as you might still find it in Ceylon or in Africa. There you are. We are already in a fixed perspective of our tradition that we say the form varies between dimensions of 2, 3 minutes and 90 minutes. This is 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and 128, 7 octaves, as we say, 7 times 2. It's, amazingly enough, the same range as we have in the field of what we call rhythm and meter, which is everything that is now the next subdivision of the larger former sectioning, the former entities, formal entities. And they are organized in bars, traditionally always, if possible, in the same periodicity, which means the tempo was fixed for one movement, let's say fast or medium fast or slow. Then they changed the tempo because everything was derived from dancing or moving the body. That's where the music comes from. Well, there we are. We have, what do we have? Let's say form begins. If you object, please raise your arms. Let's say approximately at 8 seconds and goes from 8 seconds to 90 minutes, or let's say something between 1 and 2 hours. Everything that's beyond 8 seconds, it has something to do with our perception. we remember less and less well. If duration is 13 seconds or 15 seconds, I would like to make the test. Can hardly be recognized, but you know very well that this difference of 2 seconds, if I have a sound of 1 second or 3 seconds, is enormous. So our perception is logarithmic and not arithmetic. This is important, that rhythm has its own field of perception with some transitional regions. Let's say between 8 and 16 seconds, there is a transition between rhythm and form. Rhythm has, again, its particular field of perception. 8 seconds. A sound of 8 seconds is da, da, etc. Now I don't move my hand. Da, see, it makes a very slow movement, and we are already entering into proportions where form begins, where we can clearly, like in an architecture, subdivide the time in terms of formal sections. Now 8, 4, 2, 1, a half, a fourth, 1/8, 1/16. 1/8 is the fastest we can play with our fingers. That's determined by the muscles and the construction of our body. 8 attacks, let's say, per second. That is, I could go up to 16 perhaps, or 12 or 13, 14, with very special rolling movements of my 2 hands, but then it's finished. There you see again, it's 7 times the double. 7 to 8 times the double. It's very interesting. It is almost the same range of perception. And then we start, then the low sounds, if you would do it faster, you know that from the previous example. It's slightly faster, only 16 per second. You hear the low? You hear still the individual pulses of my core, from my instrument here. And then, etc. The sound begins. That's why we call it pitch. And in between there is a region where we don't know what it really is, if we still can count the attacks or not. So there we are. Another 7 octaves, as you know from the keyboard of the piano. It has 7 to 8 octaves, 7.5 exactly. And then what is beyond that is just brilliance, color, coloring frequencies. Another 3,000 cycles is the highest about cycles per second of the piano. Then 6,000, 12,000, and then it's almost finished with older people. And no, it's finished really. We're at 10,000, 12,000. Well, you all get old. Don't worry about this. Then the music sounds, all music sounds very sweet because the brilliant high sound is no longer perceived too much. Yeah, like most people who listen to the radio, they shut off the high frequencies. And the music sounds very nice. There we are. The ranges of perception are ranges of time. Time of perception. And the time is subdivided by us, by the construction of our body and our instruments to perceive. This is extremely interesting, but a composer, for example, since having found the means, the modern means, to continuously change from one into the other, changes a rhythm into pitch, which means into tones or noises, a tone or a noise into a formal proportion. He goes through a unified musical time and composes in a unified musical time. That changes completely the traditional concept of how to compose and to think music. Because these were boxes. Harmony, melody was one, and then rhythm meter was another one. Then periods, phrases, phrasing, articulating periods and larger entities was the section of forming. And then in the timbre field we had only names. We said oboe or female voice, or we said piano, or we said a bird sound. Which means we had just very few words with which we describe the sound sources. But we have, fortunately, a very poor language to describe sounds. I mean, much poorer than in the visual field. That's why in the visual field, almost all the perception has been rationalized and has no longer any magic. Has become pretty dull, I would say, because it has been put into boxes and we have so many words to identify visual events, colors, shapes, etc., etc. Even in music we speak of the white noise, we speak of the high sounds, which comes from spatial experiences. High sound, we should say the fast sound, and even with particular description of the speed. Or we say low sounds, or we say dark sounds, or bright sounds, etc. There you see, fortunately, apart from saying whispering, all the onomatopoetic words, or what is it? Whispering, or, well, I know in German, zischend, or wischend, and the lowest are tutend, or bellend, or heulend. These are onomatopoetic words which describe with a word what we hear. But they have come out of use. In music, there is the instrumentation describing the available sound sources. This being said, I play now the first example of this lecture. I have chosen 4 sections from a work which is called KONTAKTE. KONTAKTE for electronic sounds. Did you rewind it? Let's start again, and I make the curve. Leave the lights on, please. Yes. Each sound is longer and longer, pretty dark, and now it brightens up. There it is, continuous. Now listen. It has ooh, which means almost no overtones. It goes over all, there it is. High, E, I, and disappear. And now with this single sound which I have obtained, I work for another 4 minutes. Just follow its curve. Very little intervals. Very small intervals. These are like other objects are passing by, but there's always this line of orientation. They pass by. Just looking out of the window. Now listen. Goes away very far. I will remind you. There it comes again. Slight rise. These are extremely small intervals. You wouldn't believe it. Fractions of a second minor second. It's like giving perspective to that sound. Always clack, clack, these, which comes from different sides. Higher, lower. Reaching a new plan. These are sounds like craws. I tell you later how I made them. These craws. Remember this. Yeah, remember this sound. How it sounds like. Brrr, this. The next example will begin with that last sound here, and I use it to interpret it in order to clarify what I called the splitting of the sound. If we have understood that a sound can be composed, literally put together, not just as we say as a stationary sound which doesn't change, but even ow, which is a non-stationary sound because it changes during the course of its duration. If we can compose it, put them together as componere, as it says from the Latin. Componere, composition, means to put together. Then, naturally, we can think in terms of, please, in quotation marks, decomposition of a sound. Which means we split the sound, and this is, in a certain context, much more revealing and interesting than hearing a unified sound and taking it as it is and comparing it to another one, which is at the happening at the same time or before or after this particular sound. What I mean by this is this one is serving now for another section of the composition KONTAKTE, and you will hear that this sound one by one is revealing itself as being a composed one, which means it has components. And one by one, the individual components, 6 in all, leave the original frequency. Very slowly in glissandi, going up or down. The order is down, up, down, as in the previous example. They break literally apart into their rhythmic components, into the individual pulses, but the original, so-called original frequency remains until the end of the section, and the sound literally splits up into 6 components. And each individual component is rhythmically decomposing in front of our ears. And you will realize that whenever a component, a component, is leaving the original frequency, then the timbre of that original sound changes naturally. And that makes us aware that it has been a composed one. So what do I do as a composer? Well, is it an acoustical example of a lecture of a physicist or of an acoustician who says, ladies and gentlemen, today I'm speaking about the subject of sound decomposition, and this is an example. So then music would be just reduced to pedagogic functions, like in the previous example too. Well, it is true that whereas traditionally in music and art in general, the content, or let's say the ideas, the themes, were more or less descriptive, either psychologically descriptive or descriptive about certain phenomena in the world or interhuman relationships. A composition or a decomposition of a sound, or the passing through several time layers, it may be the theme itself. Rather than meaning something with the sound, its own behavior is the meaning, its own life. And we live through exactly the same transformations that the sound is going through, and by that we change. For example, if the sound splits into 6, and we want to follow them all 6, we have to split ourselves into 6. We have to become polyphonic beings, multi-layered beings, to follow several layers of a process at the same time. Or when the sound is falling 6.5 octaves down, and you are not just fixed in your time chair, so to speak, then you have to go with it, otherwise you don't perceive it. You have to fall 6.5 octaves. That's why many people get a very strange feeling in their stomach when they hear that first example. There you are. The theme of the music, of composition itself, is the revealing of such processes, or the composition of such processes. But they could be made more or less intelligently. I mean, let's say a physics professor would just make 6.5 octaves down. Now you hear it, just there you are. And someone else might just make etc. It's a little bit more inventive, I would say. Well, if you can do it better, then the same process has been composed by different people, and one is more imaginative than the others. That's all that is about different composers. And that's also all that is about the difference between a physics professor and a composer in this context. Maybe there are certain how can we say, multi-layered beings who are several beings at the same time. That is very good then. like we have many visual artists nowadays who are mainly concerned with the exploration of new ways of seeing. The seeing itself is the theme. The way how to look at things and what we can see. It is the widening of our perception, and at the same time, as I say, most things that I see in such galleries are absolutely dull. I mean, I just see it, and I understand, yes, that's it. Or my eyes are flickering, and then I say, well, okay, I have understood. My eyes flicker when you do this, etc. It's a kind of relationship one feels like these animals in experiments, which have to show a certain reaction to a certain stimulus. That's what much of modern art is about, too, I must say. We are in a very important transition from a traditional way of perceiving art and a new way of art, making and perceiving art. We discover new functions, which is that the art itself is revelatory, is revealing existence and ourselves and changing us as human beings. And once this has started, a human being of today and in 100 years are almost incomparable, even physiologically. Don't think that we remain the same when our perception is changing so drastically, and when, for example, the perspective of musical perception becomes relative rather than absolute. Let's say the timing. When I have to pass so quickly through all speeds and tempi in music, I change completely. And I am no longer comparable to someone who is sitting in his time chair, so to speak, at metronome 60, where his heart is beating, or at metronome, let's say, 30 or 20, where his lungs are breathing, and everything that is faster he considers as being fast, and everything that is slower he considers being slow, and there he has his fixed perspective. I mean, what we need, or what we will become as individuals, not all of us, naturally, are beings who can change very quickly in time and space as well. Very quickly. And go through all these transformations and, yes, become the sounds. And this is certainly the most profound musical way of experiencing. To become what we experience, and by that expand, change, grow. The second example will be played now, and please leave the lights on. Aha, has it started? Yeah, there it is. Now follow this sound, please. you may have realized that one has to be very alert to follow the components leaving and following also the original. And I play it again. As each component decomposes into little pulses, which are then floating in an acoustic space around this line of orientation, towards the end, the last component also decomposes, etc. You have these very noisy sounds which become longer and more noisy, more like, I don't know, etc. And then they end in very heavy and noisy sound, which is the head of the next section, which I then will interpret under the perspective of the multi-layered space composition. We hear it again, and I recommend that we switch off the light. And I would even say, please, once, close the eyes as well, that you are not disturbed by any visual thing that's going on in this room, and follow the sound itself. And just try to catch as much as possible of the components leaving and their behavior, their process of floating in masses, in swarms, we can say, of individual pulses around this line of orientation. Are you ready? Then please switch off the light. We literally discover a sound which has been covered before. The last sound, like a very heavy sound event, almost white noise like at the ocean, the whoosh, this whoosh, but also with low frequencies in it, is, as I said, the head of the next musical process. which is a more static one and which is concentrating on the extreme of noise composition in this work. Now we are confronted with several layers, and I have to say something about the development of space composition in music since 1954-5. What I said about time, that people have a certain middle position in time, judging on what is faster and slower, and that this middle position is determined basically by our body, by the breathing, by the heartbeat, by the speed with which I can move, my limbs, the fingers included, my tongue, my lips, my head, etc. This determines a middle range of speed, and everything that is faster or slower, we judge from this position. The same is true in register, where our voice is, our natural voice. We consider the middle of orientation. There's our point of perspective, and everything that is much higher or much lower, we call it higher or lower. So even for women, let's say, the higher and lower is approximately an octave transposed in comparison to men. But there we again have so-called middle position of orientation, and this, for most of the people, is fixed. It's very hard to move in a musical composition of a more modern character listeners into another region. Let's say to stay for quite a long time in a very fast region, so that fast becomes the normal, and that everything that was medium before in traditional music becomes slow. Or the other way around, that I make a composition in which I have longer sections which are so extremely slow that they have never occurred in our traditional music, and we consider them very, very slow. Let's say like in gagaku music, the Japanese court music, very slow music. Then, having listened for a longer time to this very slow music, everything that was medium in speed up to that moment becomes fast, etc. There you see the change of perspective which has happened through the enormous expansion of musical timing, and nowadays a modern composition switches very fast from one time layer, from one tempo into another. Whereas, as I said before, in traditional music, we had the slow movement, the fast movement, and then there was an intermission in between, and then we had the very fast, and then the minuet movement, etc. We stayed, so to speak, in one perspective for a while. We were safe. With the modern means of traffic, naturally, this has changed a lot. We see someone walking, we move in a car, there is an airplane passing, which is very slow, extremely slow compared to my walking, and then maybe a bicycle is passing by. I mean, all sorts of means. Or I go on an airplane from the car and change from a very fast time into a slow time. What concerns my experience, because in an airplane everything becomes very slow. See, compared to the car, where the trees are passing by very fast, etc. So there we change time very quickly. And the modern man is able just to change very quickly. And if he doesn't, he gets sick. Or he even dies. Because the degree of change is just too fast. The same applies to space. Musical space has been fixed in the traditional Western music. Since musicians are no longer running through the woods and sitting on a stage, on chairs even, the function of space is, as we say, neutralized in music. Some conductors make, because of instrumentation, a difference in putting the cello at the left side compared to another conductor putting the cello at the right side in an orchestral piece, but that has no real revealing function. It doesn't move, it's fixed. All it has to serve is to clarify the music as being a static object in space. We also must say that because of the modern way of living, it is not it has, well, until the very recent situation in traffic, no longer been very important to identify clearly a sound which comes from the rear left, let's say 270 degree. If I call the circle 360 degree like someone who is on a ship, or a sound which comes from, let's say, north 215 and 45. This means the sound comes from there, rather than coming from there, which is south 270 minus 50 or minus 40. Which means we have always that one perspective. And then we sit in the concert hall on one chair, which is determined, or has been determined up to now by our money. And, well, with little variations, I would say. And there we are, which means the whole concert has this perspective. Well, I discussed a lot with my technicians in the studio about 1953 if it would be wise to put musicians on a chair and swing them around, for example. And then he said they might object, really. So then we thought it would be perhaps necessary to let them play into microphones and connect the microphones to speakers and then swing the speakers around. Then they would perhaps not object, but they objected too. Because they said, oh no, you can't do that with me, I'm here, and the sound has to come from here. The identification of this, well, we are no birds, that's the problem. If we were birds, naturally, we would not argue that way. We are just very clumsy and sitting, and most of the people can't even stand during the concert, so they must sit. Perspective is frozen, spatially. And that led to a music in which the movement and the direction of sound in space has no function. But the moment we discover the means to move the sound with any given speed in any given auditorium or even in a given space outdoors, there's no reason any longer, not only no reason, but there is the end of the fixed perspective. And relativity enters as well as in the other parameters into the composition of movement and speed of sound in space. And it becomes as important as the composition of its melodic lines, which means the changes of the pitches, or as its rhythmic characteristics, the changes of the durations. Which means that if I have a constant sound and a constant spectrum, and nothing changes in traditional terms, but just the sound makes, then this movement gives the sound a characteristic parameter, as we say, compared to another one, which is just in one direction. Or if I go over here, you see how it changes. And changing rightwise, clockwise or counterclockwise, or being at the left side, in the rear or in the front, or alternating like in a dialogue between rear left and front right, etc. These are all configurations in a space which are as meaningful as intervals in melody and harmony. So since that time I begin to speak and to compose and to find a notation of and for melodies in space, which means going up or down in space, or describing a certain configuration in a given space with a certain speed. And the extreme of this concept I have reached happily and with a lot of diplomacy, I must say, 2 years ago at the World Fair in Osaka in Japan. I collaborated with an architect and I had the chance to realize an object which I described in 1956. It is a spherical hall seating 600 people on a platform in the middle, which is sound transparent and light transparent. The people come up on rolling stairs, and then they can sit down wherever they want. There are cushions. The Japanese like this. And then there is a grid, metal grid, and then there are speakers all the way around, which means 10 circles from the bottom, no, excuse me, 7 circles in that auditorium, from the bottom to the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in the zenith. And then 10 rows vertically. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4 to 10. At any point now in this pattern can be a sound source for any singer, player, or for a sound which is on tape. So all the singers, the soloists, they were in a kind of bird nests, also in a circle. 6 there were, or on the platform itself in the center, wherever they were situated, singers, players. And they were singing always into microphones. And then the sound reached a mixing table where myself or one of my assistants was sitting. And then I had constructed a sound mill which permits, with 1 input and 10 outputs, to move the mill in any direction with any speed up to the limits of my hand, which means about 5 revolutions per second. That's very fast. Then the sound makes 5 times in a second. In any configuration, let's say I would determine now with a push-button system, I had 7 outputs of that table, reaching to any speaker. Let's say this voice I want now for the next 2 or 3 minutes to go in a spiral movement. This voice, whenever he does, or the other way around. And then another player goes at the same time in a circle in this, with a second sound mill. And another one, just with 2 potentiometers, does this kind of movement. So we have, how can you say, a polyspatial composition. This can be improvised or it can be determined. But, I mean, we improvised it because we had a wonderful time, 183 days, every day for 6.5 hours, to play with these things, you see. It was wonderful. And the Japanese would come in, you see, they are very polite. Sure. And sit down, for example. And then it would start, the lights would go off. It was very beautiful. Wherever was a speaker, there was a little light with 5 bulbs, and it looked like a sky but a very geometrically composed sky of stars. I would sit, then they saw the singer. I announced the singer in English. It was translated by a hostess into Japanese. The lights went off. So now you hear Mr. So-and-so playing a duo with Mrs. or Miss So-and-so, etc. And then it would start. And then they would see. You saw in the hall, I could always see it from the control desk. They would say, and then would go like this. And then the other way. Etc. So even if they had never heard new music, that was exotic stuff as their music is exotic stuff for us. Nevertheless, new music, old music, little importance. What is important is that when they went out. And I was very happy. Yeah, if you discover something really new, what concerns the experience of man, I mean, there's no discussion. It's just, that's the way it is. And all the rest is minor talk about little details. But that was important. It was a new experience. Well, it was a wonderful thing. They destroyed it afterwards, as stupid as these organizations are. And I tried to get it to Europe. It was not very expensive, I must say. Really not. It was made with a plastic skin, and the construction was made like they construct nowadays these scaffoldings for building houses, etc. It was very well made, and it worked. Acoustically, fantastic, I must say. Everybody said a sphere never sounds well. You have bouncing sounds which go up and down. It sounded wonderful. No problem. Very good acoustics. Good reverberation time. Everything was fine. And I think one day I will get it again. Certainly. It is such an important experience that for the first time in history, the sound moves in a controlled way around man, and you are in the center. Even with earphones, I recommend earphones actually, as long as you don't have good auditoriums. Take earphones to listen to this music where the movement of sound becomes very important. Then it moves within you, and the head becomes this sphere. And with a little imagination, you can blow up this sphere to any size. What I want to add to this concept, new concept, which, for example, now I cannot show you, I have a 2-channel tape recorder. This thing there. And I have put it on 4 speakers in the 4 corners, 1 channel here, 1 channel there. Even the rotations that are in the original and all these movements, the sound going up the walls, coming down the walls, etc., in certain configurations, and then going in spirals up and down, I can't really make them here. We did last night in London. There we had a 4-channel machine and a fairly good setup in Royal Festival Hall of speakers in a square. And then you can approximate very well the rotational movements and all the diagonal movements in space. Otherwise it becomes 2-dimensional, like a 2-dimensional visual object. And the 3rd dimension comes with the crossing of the sounds in a given space. I wanted to add to this the concept of reaching depth. The multi-layered spatial composition means the following, that not only the distance of the sounds remains constant in a circular or any a spherical movement around the listener, but that a sound can move away as far as we can imagine and come extremely close to the listener. And these are completely different characteristics, so I'm very careful when I say that up to now I have reached only 6 layers superimposed in front of each other acoustically, and that it is very difficult to add more layers. And the next example will show this. You hear these sounds which we heard last in the previous example and which are in the forefront and very dense, noisy. They cover the whole range of audibility and nothing can pierce through this wall of sound, so to speak. And then I stop it all of a sudden and you hear a second layer of sound and you become aware, it was already there, but I wasn't aware of it. You hear it and then this stops again. I cut it like with a knife and then you hear another layer. I cut it again, you hear another layer, which is in the back. Which means this depth, the spatial depth in several layers permits us to compose naturally perspectives from close to far as we traditionally compose in a 2-dimensional harmonic and melodic field. And this is really a very important thing. It's nothing new. I mean, it happens everywhere in nature. It's very important if I hear that the car is still far away, or if I hear it's just 2 feet away, I will behave differently. Well, in music, people think it doesn't matter, but beware. I mean, if the sound comes very close, it has the same effect on our electric system. And I play now this example, and you might determine yourself how many layers you are able to hear. It ends with an enormous breakout. Many little particles, acoustic particles, fly around, and they go away very far. Why is this a typical characteristic of electronic music? Why has it not been already in a Mahler symphony where he says the trumpets should blow outside of the hall? Naturally it has, but it was fairly primitive. Because playing soft to loud is not all of it. It is part of it. But imagine that someone is whispering very softly, very close to your ear, and a thunderstorm or a rocket is going up about 10 miles away. Then you're still aware that the whispering is very soft, but it's close. Whereas the rocket is extremely loud, but it's very far. And you are aware of the fact that it is very far. Now, 2 things are necessary, naturally, in such a composition is that we know what we are hearing. If we have never heard a sound before, we don't know if it's far or close. We must have heard it in the context of the music several times in order to know how it sounds when it sounds closer or further away. And there is something now very important about our concept of perception. Our concept of perception dates back, as you all know in the meantime, to Mr. Gutenberg, which means since we write, we are verticalized, and since we write, everything has become visualized and visual. The truth, the concept of truth, of perception, is entirely built on the visual. It has led to the incredible situation where nobody believes someone else if he doesn't sign it. And you know, all the fields of our social life are based on the visual. It must be proved visually. What you cannot see, most of the people do not believe. And this leads us to the very strange statement of most of the people when a sound in a given hall is moving away very far and coming close, then they say, well, that's an illusion. It has been technically made possible because nowadays they have the means to make the sound as if it were far, they say, as if, which means they distort it to such a degree that it sounds like a sound which has been produced far away, reflected by the leaves of the trees, by the walls, and reaches my ear only indirectly, having been broken, and by that it becomes, as we say, distorted. It has noise factors. Naturally, we can produce these noise factors artificially. On the other hand, the sound which reaches me directly comes as direct as possible from the sound source to my eardrums. The closest, naturally, with earphones. It's the closest possible sound. And the unreflected sound also can be produced artificially. There, they have found the means to make the as if possible, they say, that it sounds as if it were very far or as if it is very close, with the combination of dynamics, intensity, plus degree of distortion. The purer the sound, the closer it is, and also, we must say naturally, in an absolute sense, the louder it is, the closer it is. The combination of dynamics and degree of distortion give that impression of far or close. And we can do this synthetically, naturally. We don't need to run 3 miles away in order to give to a certain sound the characteristic of a sound that in life, in nature, seems to be 3 miles away. Now I come to my point. When now in this new music, where the many layers of sound, one behind the other, occur, then most of the listeners cannot even perceive it because they say, well, the walls have not moved. So it is an illusion. Well, and then I say, the fact that you say the walls have not moved is an illusion, because you have clearly heard that the sound went away very far. And that is the truth. And it is very doubtful if the walls have not moved or not. That's even had nothing to do with this perception, which means that we absolutely believe in what we hear as much as formerly we believed in what we see or saw. They see, they open their eyes, and they say, aha, well, no, there are the walls, so that was an illusion. The sound has not really moved away. There you are. Think about this. That makes it so difficult for new music to be really perceived, because there's a block in most of the people. They say it is as if, or they can't even perceive it, because they can't imagine, they can't separate themselves from the imagination. Someone, a bird or a car, must go 3 miles away before I can hear a sound 3 miles away. So they identify the sound with an object that must be in a given space away for a certain distance. And that's what we are struggling with, and that's what changes man naturally one by one if such music is more and more perceived in its real conditions. Just as, how can I say, a beginning of your own discoveries, I say these things and I cannot follow them up tonight. I play now the next example, and please listen to this excerpt of KONTAKTE under the perspective, and only under the perspective, of the multi-layered sound composition. How many layers you can hear, how a certain back background, what we call a background, becomes a background because a little figure which sounds like craws, R, it makes 2 or 3 times, and which is very close, makes that background be more even than it would be alone, sound like a background, and on the foreground we have these clear figures, which are more dry, as we say in sound, less reflective, etc. And then it ends, as I said, with this explosion in a closed space. It sounds like in an echo chamber, and it is in an echo chamber. Being far away in a closed room or being far away in a park is totally different. Can we switch off the light? The equality of tones and noises in electronic music has been made clear already by discussing the continuous transition from periodic to more or less aperiodic waves, sound waves. If the degree of aperiodicity of any given sound can be controlled, and controlled in a continuous way, then any constant sound can be transformed into a noise. And the noise is determined by a certain width, as we say, a frequency band. And the widest band goes over the whole range of audibility. We call it usually, as I said several times, the white noise. But that's not all of it, because the density, or as we might say, the energy in a given sound is must also be considered in a given noise. Even if the width of a frequency band is the same for several noises, then the degree of presence, the energy, might be quite different. And I can simply say the means are available nowadays, the electronic means, all sorts of filters or modulators, to transform steady sounds into what we call aleatoric. It comes from alia, the dice. Aleatoric sound textures. That's the technical term. We speak about aleatoric sounds, which are more or less aleatoric when we want to define noises more or less precisely. Now, if this has become possible, the continuum between tones and noises, then complete new questions come up when we compose or play intuitively, which means on the spot in a group of players, new music, because we have no experience whatsoever in dealing with balances between sounds and noises, tones and noises. In traditional Western music, the noises were taboo, literally excluded, and that had very precise reasons, because it started from the moment on when they began to notate the sounds with intervals, precise intervals. It was mainly vocal music, and vocal music, as it says, mainly sung with vowels rather than with consonants, with voiceless consonants, which means we have no music, which composed music, which is composed in a way that, let's say, if I do this, then they say that's no music. Because there you see how narrow our concept of music is. The consonants were excluded. The noises were excluded. They might happen at the end of a given vowel in order to make the word understood. In our daily language, we have all the consonants in order to clarify the meaning of certain acoustic events. But in music, they had no function. Just accents, yes. Or it, to end clearly a sound. Or ta, to start a sound very clearly. But the integration of the noises of all sorts has happened only since the middle of the century. And mainly, I must also say, through the discovery of new methods to compose this so-called continuum between tones and noises. Now, any noise is musical material. And one chooses for a given composition among this complete set of different degrees of noises and tones in a given scale, or in a scale that is determined by the composer. The balance between tones and noises is not at all a numerical one, which means when I want to finish off, like in KONTAKTE, with a situation which balances out the tones and noises. In the example you just heard before, I said we have reached the extreme of noisiness. And in the moment we started with, we had the extreme of clear pitched tones because we wanted to follow the melodic line of that tone. Now I want to deal with the whole scale of timbres between aleatoric and periodic ones, and I certainly cannot use as many noises as tones, because noises tend to cover up, to blur, and they are more primitive, so to speak. One has to be much more careful if one wants to establish balance between the two in a given section. One must reduce extremely the number of noises as compared to the number of tones. And there we are really discovering complete new principles of musical articulation. For example, in this particular work, I have worked with 42 different scales. If you don't know what that means, a piano is one scale, which means you have the half-tone scale. An octave is subdivided into 12 equal steps. Now imagine you have 42 different ones, the octave being divided into 13, 15, 17, 23 steps, etc. And I have used a scale of scales, where the degree of proportion from one scale to another one is constant. And then I have bound a particular scale to a particular family of tones or noises which I have used. Just to say it simply, the noisier the sounds which I have used, the noisiest were 2 octaves wide noises, with a band of 2 octaves wide in KONTAKTE. For them, the scale was the largest and most simple scale in KONTAKTE, only fifths, major fifths. So over the whole range of audibility, I could compose a noise which has 2 octaves wide only 11 times. That was it. 12, as you know, 12 fifths make about the range of an octave. But the more narrow the sound was, the more it approached the pure tone, the finer the scale. This is the principle I have used. As a one-to-one relationship, when I use a certain family of noises or sounds, I used a certain scale. Because I found out that with the purest tones, you can make this most subtle melodic changes, which are much, much smaller than what you read in books, that they say 80 to 81 is the smallest interval we can hear. That's not true at all. We can hear much smaller intervals if we use sine waves. And if the sine waves are not broken, but if I do it in little glissandi, so that I can really feel that little change. So the micro tones, as we say, go much far beyond of what we are taught about the old Chinese system, or of what you read in physics, in books of physics or perception. But it depends on the tone. You cannot just say any tone can be used in any interval relationship. There you are. We discover new laws of relationship between the nature of the sound and the scale with which we compose the sound. So harmony and melody are no longer abstract systems which are filled with any given sounds that we find as material, but there is a very, very subtle relationship nowadays between form and material, and I would even go so far that form and material have become one. That is the most important event, to my opinion, in the 20th century, that in several fields you cannot split any longer the material from the form and say I use this material and put it into that form, but that a certain given material finds its own and its best form. It has its inner tendency to come into its best form, so to speak. Material and form become one, and the forming is automatically based on the research of the characteristics of a given material. And it's no longer an abstract concept, form or material, of matter and form. The old dialectic based on the antinomy between, or dichotomy between form and matter has really disappeared since we produce electronic music. and we become aware of the nature of the sound itself and its relativity. I play now the last section of KONTAKTE, and you might judge yourself if in that section I have achieved what I tried to achieve, a balance between tones and noises, between sound events that have clear pitch and melodic lines and noises which have a less precise melodic lines and have this band characteristic and the cover effect, etc. I play now the end of KONTAKTE, and we switch off the lights again, and as I said before, try to follow the many lines and the many layers as much as possible, because I'm sure you will not hear this sort of music so soon again. Switch off the lights. I have tried to clarify 4 criteria of electronic music and the composition of electronic music. The first one was the unified time structuring. The second one, the splitting or the decomposition of the sound. The third one, the multi-layered spatial composition. And the fourth one, the continuum of tones and noises and the equality of right given to tones and noises in new music.
There are 2 live performers in KONTAKTE.
Yes.
What's the relationship between the tape-recorded music and the live music, and why don't you put it all on the tape?
Well, there is a record where both are together, but I prefer to consider both as being independent, autonomous versions, the tape alone and the tape with 1 percussion player and 1 piano player. You might have already realized that in KONTAKTE, every once in a while, sounds sound like sounds that we know, like metal sounds, skin sounds, wood sounds, and sounds of a sort of consonant family, etc. And within these categories, well, a performance in a hall with the 2 soloists shows that they function like traffic signs in an unknown country. There is, let's say on a different star, all of a sudden you would have a point of an element that you know, a piano sound, and then you refer everything to this known phenomenon. And I think the complexity of the musical experience becomes even more rich when you literally see the instrument and his action, and this is down to earth, a physical act. As I said, it functions as something that you can identify, that you can name. And then the sounds which you cannot name and which go away and transform, let's say, a sound which sounds like a cymbal into a sound which sounds like an African log drum continuously. This becomes even more mysterious because you see that log drum and the cymbal, and they had never had anything to do with each other up to that moment. But then you see that they are just selections out of a continuous scale of possible colors. As I have very sometimes mentioned in this context, it is much more magic to find an apple on the moon than to find a moonstone on the moon. Because a banal object, which is known here, and nobody would even look at it, an ashtray, if you would find it on a different star, it takes on magic. Yes?
I found the speed at which the incidents occurred in your music rather breathtaking. Is it possible that, do you regard the traditional way that we listen to music, or the music that we're brought up on, as it were, as actual barrier to the appreciation of your spatial polyphony, as it were? And if so, what are the implications as far as education of the public go?
Well, I have 6 children, and they pick it up as the most natural thing in the world when they go with me to rehearsal, or when they hear talk about it. Some like certain works better, or not so well. It must start in early childhood. I mean, there's no other way. I had a teacher in information theory, Meyer Epler, the famous Meyer Epler. He said, beware Stockhausen, it takes at least 35 years until anything comes through. Even with the horses, certain nerves become thicker when you always give them the same signal, he said, physiologically speaking. He said, do you think with human beings it can go much faster? Just wait for another generation. I mean, certain people are just out already with 18 years. Finished. They are old like others with 90, and there are very few, naturally, who are with 80 like very young people. It's just the question how much everybody trains himself in renewing constantly his ability to perceive, and well, it needs a lot of spiritual training. to remain young. I think everybody has certainly heard about the book The Future Shock of Alvin Toffler. The basic problem of the next 20, 30, or not only that, but let's say of the whole time of Aquarius in particular, will be that most of the people can't keep track with the speed of change. They just get a shock, and then that's out. All they need is, in a skyscraper, a meditation center, where they just sit longer and longer every day in order to be fit for the work. But most of the people won't keep, no, how do you say it, won't go with the speed of evolution. And that's basically a question of our extrasensitory and sensitory system.
This has probably been touched on slightly before, but I'd like to just dwell on just a bit, and that is the question of the dehumanization in contemporary music that some people have been talking about.
Yeah.
And I mean it specifically of electronic music.
Yes.
And you know, the two criticisms that have been made are both that the medium itself is dehumanized, like, you know, the sine wave and the others are very bare, sterile. They don't have, you know, the human eccentricities around them that we hear in a concert hall. The second criticism is perhaps a little more fundamental, and that has to do with the actual content. You know, although you don't divorce it from the form, you call it the form. I mean, there is some sort of content, and presumably this is a reflection of some sort of social phenomenon. And the question is, in effect, if this phenomenon is so dehumanized itself, maybe the art is going to die fairly quickly. I mean, if the art doesn't have the potential of touching basic human concerns such as love, hate, you know, these kinds of things, can it live? Is it really valid art?
Well, there are two possible answers to what you have said. The first one is, it is certainly a mistake to consider all human beings equal. Between, as Albert Schweitzer says, the ape and the saint, there is a whole scale. And they all look like human beings, more or less. There are other people who say that from about 23 years onwards, everybody is responsible for his face, for the way he looks like. What we mean by this is that there are certainly very few people who constantly work on their degree of illumination and on the expansion of their consciousness. And we are in a state as human beings of multiplying with an enormous speed. And I doubt if the most illuminated people will multiply with the highest speed. Which means that in a very necessary and healthy way, subconsciousness is exploding. And I say subconsciousness, not supraconsciousness. The second answer to your question is a little bit more esoteric. If you have ever heard the name Sri Aurobindo, then you might know that there is an Indian sage who died in 1950, who has foreseen several thousand years of human evolution, or involution, as he says. And basically, he says that we are in a situation nowadays which is comparable to the situation when, like in 2001, that's not what he says, I add this in brackets, when the first so-called human being came out of the kingdom of beings that were not called, or that the scientists or the human beings do not call human beings. Well, we say animals. There is nowadays even controversial talk about the fact if not the human beings have been a special breed from the beginning on. Nevertheless, there is that moment in 2001 where the ape takes a bone and kills the other one with a bone. The flesh of intelligence rises him above the others, though he is physically weaker. Aurobindo says that we are at the threshold of a new terrestrial mutation where a few beings, very few beings for the time being, are changing into something else, into a kind of supra-human being. And what you call the dehumanizing actually is the fear of the majority of us that they might not make it. And they call this dehumanize. What they really mean, without being able to verbally formulate it that way, is not the dehumanizing, but the superhumanizing or the suprahumanizing. That jump, that enormous jump, like from, let's say, from the animal to man, from the man to a superhuman spirit or being. And this is certainly, what concerns my personal experience, true. There are already beings among the human beings who are in every sense far beyond the rest. And this is clear from the way, not only the way they live and behave, but from what they can do, what they really can do. And certainly the arts reflect this whole process as well. And this naturally is a moment of extreme crisis, which is that fruitful moment that comes very rare in the world ages, where everything switches on a new level. The consciousness switches on a new level, but not in large numbers. We might ask Aurobindo why not all the animals have become human beings. We can say nowadays they almost have. I mean, the chicken farms are still retarding this process a little bit, but what you eat there is certainly more cardboard than animals. What I mean by this, we have almost eaten up the crust of plants and animals of this world and transformed it into human bones and flesh. And this process will certainly continue with an enormous asymptotic speed until the middle of next century, or a little longer, until we are 15 billion. And then the food certainly will be scratched on the bottom of the sea or produced completely artificially with chemicals. It's a little importance, actually, what we eat. What I mean is that everything is transformed ultimately into human beings, yes. Then there are no animals anymore in a few zoos and in a few photographs. Yes, we still can see them, but the principle has been to transform it into human beings. And then the next step is naturally, what are the human beings becoming? At least now we can say only very few will make it. And the general fear and crisis reflects simply that process. Most of the beings feel they have that inner clock which tells them where the evolution is going, but they can't make it in this life. So that creates antagonism and wars and fights and discussions and God knows what. Exterminations, fascist systems, all sorts of things. It's a sign of rebirth of humanity. Yes?
Are you writing music for this suprahuman minority?
Well, I would say if you all want to belong to it, yes. I'm not writing music for anybody, which means I just write it because it must be written and it comes into my mind, and I have to work very hard to get it down, and then you do with it whatever you like.
Well then, since you spend so much trouble preparing and communicating the music, does it worry you that it doesn't communicate to a very large proportion of human beings?
Oh, no. If I would like to do that, I would certainly have been the best imitator of the Beatles. And what they got in 7 years, I might have continued a little longer, because they would never have worked in a quartet, you may be sure. No, that's just the question if the large number is a sign for anything. The large number is a sign for mediocrity or even for banality. That's what it is. Yes.
How do you suggest we differentiate between electronic music and musical garbage?
Oh, electronic music, most of the electronic music is garbage. There's no question about that, because the most untalented composers have shown up in the studios because they had no chance to compose somewhere else. So they sit in the studio until someone says, well, okay, try your luck, and then there they are, because they believe in the means more than in themselves. They think if they use modern means, it will be interesting just because of the means, which is a terrible error.
Now, are you concerned about this largely in raising the level of consciousness, or the broadening the consciousness of the listeners to this music, so that they are aware of all sounds?
It would be wonderful if the awareness, the consciousness rises, but I have said that there are very, very critical how do you say, borderlines, and they cannot be easily overcome. So I have no illusions about the future. Everybody, as I said before, everybody uses my music anyway. If I break my neck tonight in a car crash, then little importance. The people use my music anyway the way they want. They are absolutely free, and there should be no systems to tell people what they should think about music and how they should experience it, because everybody is different. In that sense, I'm an extreme individualist, and I suggest that everybody makes up his mind about his life and the world and Mr. Stockhausen's music.
Mr. Stockhausen, some of the things you said made me think that perhaps there is some connection between the kind of experiences which you're interested in and the kinds of experiences which some people at any rate have connected with psychedelic experiences. Are you aware of any such connection?
No, certainly. Everything belongs together in our present day's scene. That is simply another answer. The people who can't make it through spiritual yoga make it through chemicals, or try to make it through chemicals. The only trouble is that whenever the chemical is not in the body, they fall flat, which means they just fall on their nose, and they need the chemical immediately again in order to keep that level of sort of passive and totally egocentric perception. But what I want is that through spiritual discipline, someone rises on a level which he doesn't lose anymore, and which he can then give to others, where he can be really productive and serve the society. That he is in a state where he constantly can give. He has a surplus production. And I have seen in my life a lot of very dear, close friends who became almost uninterested in the rest of the world when they were in this state. Yeah.
You find that in the rooms where they're playing Stockhausen, they also tend to be smoking marijuana. Does it strike you that there's a connection?
I can't understand you. If I go around the campus and find in the rooms what?
Where they're playing Stockhausen,
yeah,
they're also smoking marijuana. Does it strike you that there's a connection between the two?
Oh no. I know this from my personal assistant, who is an American and who has described me that he has heard in KONTAKTE for the first time in his life under the influence, even under the influence of this enormously slowed down time. He has heard things which he obviously had not heard before when he was a student in the composition class, which means that obviously for certain amounts of time expands the preciseness and the depth of perception. It speeds up our perception time, or it slows it down. And as the most realistic futurologists say, already around 2000, almost 9 out of 10 people will be always turned on with some kind of drug, not just with 2 or 3, but you can buy them by then, naturally, because the individual responsibility for yourself increases with the modern society. You can buy a drug which speeds you up to the speed of an animal that lives 400 years, like a turtle, yes, and you have the perception of a turtle, or you can have the perception of a one-day fly. which means you perceive so fast that what another one needs 70 years for, you perceive it in that time. The only trouble is how long you can stretch the ability of your body, and if you could not perhaps reach such different states of timing and spacing just without chemicals. That is a problem. And it will be a terrible problem of communication, because you never know on which wavelength your partner is. You just ask him, are you on 400 or 233? Then he says, okay, then, yeah, could you switch me on too, because I want to talk to you. That will be the problem of total atomization of the society, because fear, that famous fear about which I spoke if they make it or not, this enormous jump, spiritual jump, this fear produces naturally anxiety in the anxiety, and they want to have experience that is described by very famous yogis or lamas. So they read about it and they think there is something, and there is something very profound, very important. And we all, I mean, we should make it, but we should try to find ways which are spiritual. You can do it chemically, but it has its enormous setbacks. Our body cannot be stretched in any direction. It breaks.
How would you advise a non-super person to expand his consciousness in order to perceive the sort of things you're talking about? I mean, without using drugs, how are we to go about expanding our minds to meet this new challenge which you're posing to us?
Well, there are many ways. The first of all is there are, for example, read. There are a million books now available who can say it much better than myself. Read the book, let's say, Concentration of Maoni. You can buy it in any bookstore, and he tells you what you can do for exercises, daily exercises. And then another book is called Meditation, of the same author. He is particularly good, that's why I mention him. And then another one is called Samadhi. There's so much available nowadays in reaching these new disciplines which go beyond the intellectual training that we have learned in schools and universities. It's just starting, yeah.
The yogis and lamas you've spoken about, who have developed a rarefied state of perception, have done it only by withdrawing from society in isolation.
Not Aurobindo. He was a very important figure in the spiritual revolutionary war against the Englishmen in India. And Gandhi could only build his whole activity on the basis that was laid by Aurobindo. Oh no, his brother, and he himself got a lifetime sentence, my dear. He sent his brother to Europe in order to learn how to make bombs. And he was, compared to Gandhi, he was ferociously against the Germans during the Third Reich, whereas Gandhi was always advising the Englishmen the non-violent war, etc. And Aurobindo understood quite well, like in the old Indian history, where you see the battle between Hanuman and the demons. He said, wipe them out, because they will be reborn in a much better form than they are there. So he was a very practical and pragmatic man, and not at all someone who would withdraw on the peak of the Himalaya and sit there and be happy for himself. That's exactly what his new yoga is all about. Not withdraw, but feed it back and try to keep that state and constantly making contact with the rest. Yes?
Do you believe that there's a natural limit to the development of music beyond which no further progress can be made?
I don't believe that there is any natural limit, no matter where and how and when. Yeah.
When you compose or construct your music, do you try to introduce into it any form of symmetry or pattern? Or
Yes.
is it completely random?
Oh, no. But this leads us on to tomorrow morning, I would say. Read, for example, an article about the shifting of symmetries in the music of Webern, which I have written in the early 50s. The axial symmetries and what's the other name? 2 plus 2. Axial is when you have 3 and 1 in the middle, for example. There's another kind of symmetry. Symmetries by pairs or impairs. Yeah, right. non-retrograde or retrograde, we say also. Well, certainly, that is very important in all my work.
Well, listening to the music we've heard tonight, I couldn't find any pattern in it at all. It just seemed to be random to me. Perhaps I'm one of these 999 out of...
No. The way is long, as they say, but but fruitful. Yeah.
Where to reach?
I have a feeling you need more of this sort of discussions because you make me stay here until tomorrow. Yeah? What is...
Reach the level of consciousness that is needed to appreciate your music. If one were to reach it, would you suggest one to stay there at that level, that open to all forms of perception, to touch, to sight and to sound? Or should one switch on to it and switch off during the time one is listening to your music? I suggest that if you will, one is always in this state of complete awareness, such as a drug might bring to you, a greater sense of expansion of time, that it might eventually send one completely mad.
Oh. You see, my music is not so important in this whole context. You are always referring to my music. What does it mean, my music? It's just something that has come into my mind and I'm working all the time and that's it. So I'm a myth. I'm a name, and if I go away, then it's just a tag on something that vibrates within yourself. When you are confronted with this so-called music, it has a name. So in order to identify it. But that's so like Beethoven, who is he? He was a very miserable person, I must say, as a human being. And he is a myth for something that we are, that is within ourselves. We are echoing. Beethoven is part of us, or he doesn't exist. And in that sense, I think it's only a means. It's like a spiritual food of all sorts. And it will be used by certain people who discover a certain identity of what they are and what is vibrating. They choose more of it, they like it. Liking means, as I always say, remembering. When I like something, then I discover something that I have been before, that is profoundly already within me. It resonates like a piano that you hit. The whole life should be then on that level, not just when you listen to music. Pardon?
Your music is a sort of teaching mechanism.
I think everything should be this kind of self-teaching mechanism, yes. Everything. Every talk, every food, everything. Pardon?
I was struck how you used the phrase, we become what we experience, one stage. Is that a metaphor, and if not, what does it mean?
No. I very often say you become what you eat. And only in a very... Yes, naturally. That's why since a certain time I really stopped eating meat of pigs. Not... And meat in general, I mean, it's very difficult to integrate it. Because only very few people transform what they eat into what they are. That needs, you see, that what they eat becomes what they are. But most of the people become what they eat. Well, it literally means what I'm saying.
Well, I'm afraid I didn't understand English, if that's the case. I think.
You become what you eat. If you eat bananas, you become you
become a big banana.
Yes. Yes. If you eat a lot of cows and bulls and God knows what, and then one by one you become deeply influenced by their atomic structure. You become what they are. So you have to be very careful in what you eat. and yes, you see, I'm defending a new kind of how do you call it when human beings eat each other? Yes, on a higher level, I certainly would defend a new kind of cannibalism. Because Except it's very difficult to choose someone whom I would eat, I must say. Yeah, but you see, the people who really were very close to the magic force of life, they knew this. They would only eat someone who was the best foe. The best foe. And I think the fact that still nowadays at the court of China, they have a very special delicacy, if you are informed about it, that they for example, they excite apes, monkeys, up to the degree that they are very angry, and in that state they cut off their skull and eat the fresh brain. That is a delicacy at the court in China. Isn't it? There you are.
You said something about, I think, a mind dividing into two, didn't you? I may misquote, maybe misquoting it. Our consciousness dividing into two when we're hearing something.
Becoming
into
polyphonic
two?
beings.
Pardon?
Becoming polyphonic beings.
Oh, yes, I said following two things at the same time. That is what we call the cocktail effect in information theory, which means that when you are 5 people in a room, or 10 people in a room, then 5 couples of 2 can understand each other, though they are all talking with maximum loudness, which means you can follow 2 lines at once. And in old polyphonic music, in the Bach piece, for example, someone who has learned to listen better than other people, he can follow 2 lines at the same time. Or, as many people say, Napoleon could talk to someone and at the same time write a letter.
Only 2 at once.
Yeah, well, yes. You see, it's already quite a lot, isn't it? But in music, we sometimes can follow. Doing and perceiving is something else. So we can follow up to 3, if it's not too complicated, 3 layers of events. Watching you, I'm talking, my brain is going almost automatic because I see what your colors are, etc. And at the same time, I can still think of someone in Cologne now. How he looks like, etc. I have 3 things. I'm doing 3 things for.
This is like the housewife sitting at home, watching television, while knitting and talking to her husband, listening for the baby crying.
Well, I would say the latter one is certainly excluded, otherwise she would jump up and leave the husband alone for a while. Yes, well, we are all trained daily in this polyphonic new way of becoming polyphonic beings. Yeah. Yes.
What do you think of the effects of living in an environment where there is a continuous background noise, i.e. an urban environment?
Where a normal environment.
An urban environment.
An urban.
Yes. I mean, what is your reaction to the noise in Oxford?
What is that question?
Not the noisy person. What is your reaction to the noise in Oxford?
Very calm here compared to London.
Well, it is in this hall, yes, but I mean out in the streets, Corn Market, High Street.
I will ask myself tonight because I'm not conscious of it. I have arrived this afternoon.
What effect
I don't know.
does will urban noise generally have on man, do you think? Do you have any opinion on that?
Yeah, like all the pollution. Acoustic pollution is even worse than the rest. I'm trying to sue my neighbor since about 6 months because he has 5 shepherds and a parrot. And the parrot is yelling from 6 o'clock in the morning, hard out all the time. and I tell you, it calls out the devil in me. I mean, if I'm thinking of all sorts of poisons and God knows what. You may be sure. Well, it's just impossible. I'm trying to sue him now, and we have just set up already the whole legal case when we go to the court. All my friends come with me, and professors and so. And KONTAKTE, the pianist, has already decided that he will come and said, may Mr. Stockhausen leave the room for a moment, please? And then they say, why? I said, yeah, well, I have to tell you something very serious. And then, because I want to get my case through, naturally, and we have informed each other what to do. So we made the plan that he will tell the judge that, you see, Mr. Stockhausen, since already 6 years, since he lives in that house, he is showing very strange... You see, he has asked already in three scores now, in Microphony 1 and in movementã as well, and in the new score, the well-trained musicians, I mean, like me, for example, I'm a professor of music, a pianist, to bark like dogs. That, you see, he says barking, and I think that goes a little too far. I think you should really stop these shepherds, because God knows what he's doing next. That's it. Well, we tried to get rid of this musical garbage, as I say. I have invented a garbage disposal device for acoustic garbage, which is the following. I just talked about it today. In every larger city, I play Leonardo now, there will be microphones in every corner. And the microphones pick up all the noises that are there, the sounds, and they will be fed into a computer which analyzes immediately the sound wave, and then through thousands of small speakers, which are also distributed everywhere, produces them in counterphase, so that every person who's coming into this area, he says, and then I say, then they should install public, how do you say, dressing rooms, like pissoirs, etc., like in France, we have them right on the road, in Paris, where the people can acoustically see? Yes. What is the right word? You know what I mean? They're there, they can say anything what they want. There are wonderful walls like in Israel. The wall of where you can really shout against and say all the things, and then when you have emptied yourself, okay, then you go back into the silent area. Yeah.
Sorry, another question. The stewards asked me if you could.
Oh, by all means, yes. Thank you.